The story of the Han Dynasty begins with a question that still unsettles historians. How does a civilization capable of inventing paper, mastering iron, and organizing millions of people under a sophisticated bureaucracy collapse into civil war and ruin? The Han Dynasty was not merely a political regime. It was a machine, an immense and intricate system designed to transform land, labor, and knowledge into imperial power. For 4 centuries, this machine reshaped East Asia, and creating one of the most advanced societies of the ancient world. Yet the same system that produced extraordinary innovation eventually fractured from within. To understand that fall, you must first understand the engine that made the empire possible. The world the Han inherited was broken. Only a few decades earlier, the ruthless Qin dynasty had briefly unified the land through heavy taxation, forced labor, and extreme violence. But when the first Qin emperor died in 210 BCE, that brittle, unforgiving empire shattered overnight. The countryside erupted into chaos as regional warlords competed for control. Out of this violent struggle emerged a man named Liu Bang. Unlike many of his rivals, Liu Bang was not born into nobility. He had once worked as a minor government official responsible for escorting prisoners. According to historical accounts, he was charismatic but unremarkable, a man who drank heavily and preferred laughter to strict discipline. Yet he possessed one crucial advantage: he understood people. As rebellion spread across the Qin Empire, Liu Bang gathered followers not through fear, but through loyalty. Farmers, soldiers, and local officials began to rally behind him. They believed he represented something the Qin rulers had forgotten: moderation. By 202 BCE, Liu Bang defeated his greatest rival, the brilliant but ruthless general Xiang Yu. China had a new emperor. He would rule as Emperor Gaozu of Han, and the dynasty he founded would shape Chinese civilization for centuries. But victory alone could not sustain an empire. The new Han rulers faced a staggering challenge: how to govern a territory that stretched across thousands of miles and contained tens of millions of people. The Qin had attempted to solve this problem through brutal centralization. They divided the empire into administrative districts governed by appointed officials who answered directly to the emperor. The Han did something different. Rather than abolish the Qin system entirely, they refined it. This was one of the dynasty's greatest strengths. The Han rulers were pragmatic. They understood that while the Qin system had been harsh, its administrative structure was efficient. So they softened it. Local leaders were given greater flexibility. Punishments became less severe. Taxes were reduced. The emperor presented himself not as a tyrant, but as a moral ruler guided by Confucian philosophy. Confucian scholars believed that a stable society required ethical leadership, disciplined bureaucracy, and respect for social hierarchy. Under the Han, these ideas became state policy. Gradually, a new administrative model emerged, one capable of governing a vast population without constant military force. At the heart of this system was bureaucracy. Officials known as scholar administrators managed every aspect of imperial life. They recorded tax revenues, oversaw irrigation systems, managed grain storage, supervised legal disputes, and maintained communication between distant provinces and the imperial capital. This was not a small undertaking. By the height of the Han Dynasty, imperial administrators were responsible for managing a population estimated between 50 and 60 million people. Such a massive administrative system required tools, and the Han would soon invent one of the most transformative tools in human history: paper. But before paper revolutionized information, another breakthrough transformed the physical world of the empire: iron. For centuries, Chinese societies had relied primarily on bronze tools and weapons. Bronze was durable and valuable, but it had limitations. Producing bronze required large quantities of copper and tin, metals that were difficult to acquire in sufficient supply. Iron offered a different possibility. Iron ore was abundant throughout China. Once metallurgists mastered the techniques required to smelt and cast iron, the results were astonishing. The Han state invested heavily in iron production. Massive furnaces were constructed in government-controlled foundries. Skilled metallurgists developed advanced casting techniques that allowed iron to be shaped into plowshares, axes, sickles, and weapons. These tools reshaped the countryside. Iron plows could cut deeper into soil than bronze tools. Farmers could cultivate land that had previously been difficult to farm. Agricultural productivity increased dramatically. More food meant larger populations. Larger populations meant more workers, more soldiers, and more taxpayers. Iron also transformed the military. Han armies equipped with iron weapons and armor gained a significant advantage over rivals. Crossbows with iron trigger mechanisms allowed soldiers to fire powerful bolts with remarkable accuracy. And the empire's enemies, particularly the nomadic Xiongnu tribes of the northern steppe, soon discovered that the Han military machine was formidable. Technology and administration were beginning to merge. But there was still one problem: information. Running an empire requires records, tax reports, legal documents, military orders, agricultural data. Under earlier dynasties, these records were written on bamboo strips tied together with string. Bamboo was durable, but it was heavy. A single government archive might contain thousands of bamboo slips. Transporting them across the empire was slow and cumbersome. The solution came during the 1st century CE. An imperial court official named Kai Lun refined a method for producing a new writing material made from plant fibers, rags, and bark. The result was thin, flexible, and far lighter than bamboo: paper. At first glance, paper may seem like a simple invention, but its impact was revolutionary. Documents could now be written, stored, copied, and transported with unprecedented efficiency. Bureaucrats could record detailed information about taxation, agriculture, and population across vast distances. The Han administrative machine suddenly gained a powerful new memory. Data could move across the empire faster than ever before. Paper allowed the Han state to manage complexity on a scale that earlier dynasties could never have imagined. By combining bureaucratic governance, an iron technology, and the emerging power of paper, the Han Dynasty constructed one of the most sophisticated administrative systems of the ancient world. It was an empire powered by knowledge as much as by armies. But this remarkable machine would soon grow even larger. Because beyond China's borders lay deserts, mountains, and distant kingdoms connected by trade routes that stretched thousands of miles. And when the Han began to expand westward into these unknown regions, they would create a network of commerce and culture that linked civilizations across continents. The world would soon know it as the Silk Road, and through it the Han Dynasty would become something even greater than a powerful empire. It would become the center of a global system. The Han Empire was not content to remain a powerful kingdom confined within the borders of ancient China. Once the administrative machine of the state began to stabilize, the rulers of the Han turned their attention outward. Beyond the empire's western frontier lay deserts, mountain ranges, and scattered oasis kingdoms that formed the gateway to something far greater: trade. At first, these lands were mysterious and dangerous. The regions beyond the Hexi corridor, a narrow strip of fertile land connecting China to Central Asia, were dominated by nomadic tribes and shifting alliances of small states. On caravans that attempted to cross these territories often vanished into the vastness of the desert. But somewhere beyond those deserts were civilizations that possessed goods China had never seen. And China had something the world desperately wanted: silk. For centuries, Chinese artisans had mastered the delicate process of raising silkworms and weaving their threads into shimmering fabrics. The techniques were guarded carefully, and the results were astonishing. Silk was light, strong, and luminous in a way no other textile could match. In distant lands, silk quickly became a symbol of luxury and prestige. Roman elites would later pay enormous sums for bolts of Chinese silk, even though many had no idea where the fabric originated. To them, it came from a mysterious civilization somewhere beyond the eastern horizon. The Han rulers realized that this demand could transform their empire. But before trade could flourish, the empire had to confront a dangerous obstacle: the Xiongnu. The Xiongnu were a powerful confederation of nomadic tribes who controlled much of the northern steppe. Skilled horsemen and archers, they moved swiftly across the grasslands, raiding settled communities and disrupting trade routes. For the Han Dynasty, they represented both a military threat and an economic barrier. As long as the Xiongnu dominated the northern frontier, any attempt to establish long-distance trade across Central Asia would be impossible. The early Han emperors tried diplomacy first. They attempted a strategy known as heikin, or peace through kinship, which involved marrying Chinese princesses to Xiongnu leaders and sending annual gifts of silk, grain, and wine. For a time, this arrangement brought stability, but the peace was fragile. Raids continued, and the tribute payments drained imperial resources. Many Han officials believed the empire was humiliating itself by paying off nomadic rivals. Eventually, Yuta new emperor decided that compromise had gone far enough. His name was Emperor Wu. Ascending the throne in 141 BCE, Emperor Wu was one of the most ambitious rulers in Chinese history. Where earlier emperors had focused on consolidation, Wu envisioned expansion. He believed the Han Empire could dominate not only China, but the entire network of trade routes stretching across Central Asia. To do this, he would first need information. Beyond the frontier, little was known about the lands and peoples of the western regions. So Emperor Wu made a bold decision. He sent an envoy into the unknown. In 138 BCE, a court official named Zhang Qian was dispatched on a mission that would become legendary. His objective was to travel west and form an alliance with a distant people known as the Yuezhi, who had also suffered attacks from the Xiongnu. If the Han and the Yuezhi could unite against their common enemy, the Xiongnu might finally be defeated. The journey was perilous from the beginning. Shortly after leaving China, Zhang Qian and his companions were captured by the Xiongnu. For more than a decade, he lived among them as a prisoner. Most men would have abandoned the mission, but Zhang Qian waited. Eventually, he managed to escape and continued his journey westward. Traveling across deserts and mountain passes, he encountered kingdoms and cultures that no Chinese envoy had ever seen before. Although the Yuezhi ultimately declined to form an alliance, Zhang Qian returned to China with something equally valuable: knowledge. His reports described a vast network of civilizations across Central Asia. Kingdoms rich in horses, precious stones, spices, and unfamiliar crops. For the first time, the Han court understood the full scope of the lands beyond its borders. There was an entire world waiting to be connected. Emperor Wu acted quickly. Han armies began pushing westward, de-establishing garrisons and fortresses along the Hexi corridor. These military outposts protected travelers and secured the routes that caravans would follow across the deserts. Gradually, a chain of trade networks emerged. Chinese silk traveled west through oasis cities like Dunhuang and Kucha. From there, merchants carried it further across Central Asia to Persia, the Middle East, and eventually the Mediterranean. In return, new goods flowed eastward. Fine horses from the Fergana Valley became prized by Han generals. Grapes, pomegranates, and alfalfa were introduced into Chinese agriculture. Glassware, precious metals, and exotic spices began appearing in Chinese markets. The network connecting these exchanges would later be known as the Silk Road. But the Silk Road was never a single road. It was a vast web of caravan paths stretching across deserts, mountains, and grasslands. Traders moved in stages, exchanging goods between different regions rather than traveling the entire route themselves. Through these networks, ideas traveled alongside merchandise. Buddhist teachings from India began moving east toward China. Artistic styles and technologies crossed cultural boundaries. The Han Empire was no longer isolated. It had become a central hub in an emerging global system. The economic impact was enormous. Silk exports generated vast wealth for the imperial treasury. Merchant communities grew rapidly in major cities, and urban culture flourished. Markets expanded with new foods, new fabrics, and new forms of entertainment. Foreign traders appeared in Chinese cities, bringing stories and traditions from distant lands. Chang'an, the Han capital, became one of the largest and most cosmopolitan cities in the ancient world. But trade alone could not sustain such a massive empire. The state still required a reliable system for selecting capable administrators. If the Han bureaucracy became corrupt or incompetent, the entire imperial machine could falter. To solve this problem, the Han Dynasty began developing a revolutionary concept: merit. Rather than relying solely on hereditary aristocrats to govern provinces, the Han court increasingly sought officials who demonstrated intellectual ability and moral discipline. Confucian scholars played a key role in shaping this system. They believed that government officials should be selected based on education and character rather than birth. Over time, the Han state began recruiting talented scholars from across the empire and appointing them to administrative positions. This process laid the foundation for what would later become the imperial civil service examination system. It was a radical idea. In theory, even a man of humble background could rise to power through learning and discipline. Knowledge became a path to authority. This system strengthened the bureaucracy and created a class of educated officials whose loyalty was tied to the imperial state rather than local aristocratic families. For centuries, this model would influence the governance of China and inspire similar ideas in other civilizations. The Han Empire was evolving into something unprecedented, a society where technology, trade, and intellectual governance combined to form a powerful and sophisticated system. But beneath the surface of this golden age, subtle tensions were beginning to grow. Wealth was accumulating in unexpected places. Powerful families were quietly expanding their landholdings. And inside the imperial court, new figures were gaining influence over the emperor himself. These developments seemed small at first, but they would soon create cracks in the very foundations of the Han state. And those cracks would eventually grow into fractures that no amount of iron or paper could repair. At its height, the Han Dynasty was one of the most remarkable civilizations the ancient world had ever seen. Across a vast landscape stretching from the Pacific coast to the deserts of Central Asia, an intricate system of administration, trade, and innovation was humming with life. Fields of grain spread across the fertile plains of the Yellow River Valley. On iron tools glinted in the hands of farmers clearing new land. Caravans laden with silk and spices moved steadily westward along desert routes, and at the heart of this immense system stood the imperial capital, Chang'an. Few cities in the ancient world rivaled its scale or sophistication. Surrounded by towering walls and carefully organized into districts, the city functioned as the administrative and cultural center of the Han Empire. Wide avenues divided neighborhoods of merchants, scholars, artisans, and government officials. Markets bustled with activity as traders from distant lands displayed exotic goods. Foreign envoys wandered through the capital's streets, astonished by the wealth and order they encountered. But Chang'an was more than a trading hub. It was the brain of the empire. Within its palaces and administrative offices, thousands of officials worked to manage the lives of millions of people. Reports from distant provinces arrived daily, carried by mounted couriers along well-maintained roads. Grain shipments were tracked, tax revenues recorded, military orders drafted. The Han government had become a machine of astonishing complexity, and it relied increasingly on the power of knowledge. The rise of Confucian scholarship was one of the defining features of this era. Confucius himself had lived centuries earlier during a time of political fragmentation. His teachings emphasized moral leadership, social harmony, and respect for hierarchy. A ruler, he argued, should govern not through fear, but through virtue. The Han emperors embraced these ideas. Confucian philosophy provided a powerful justification for centralized authority while promoting stability within society. It emphasized the importance of educated officials who would guide the empire according to ethical principles. To cultivate such officials, the Han court established the Imperial Academy. This institution trained promising students in the classical texts of Confucian thought. There they studied history, ethics, ritual, and governance. The goal was not merely intellectual development, but moral refinement. Students were expected to embody the virtues of loyalty, discipline, and responsibility. Those who excelled could be recommended for positions within the bureaucracy. The system was still far from the fully formalized examination system that would emerge in later dynasties, but the foundations were already in place. Knowledge was becoming the currency of power. For many families, education offered a path to influence that had once been reserved only for hereditary aristocrats. This transformation helped stabilize the empire during its most prosperous years. But prosperity often carries hidden consequences. As trade expanded and agricultural production increased, wealth began to concentrate in new and powerful ways. Large landowners emerged across the countryside. These elite families accumulated vast estates worked by tenant farmers and laborers. With iron tools and improved farming techniques, their lands produced enormous harvests. The wealth generated from these estates flowed upward into the hands of a small but increasingly influential class. At first, this development seemed beneficial. Large estates could invest in irrigation systems, storage facilities, and agricultural innovation. They contributed to the overall productivity of the empire. But they also created a dangerous imbalance. Small farmers, the backbone of the Han tax system, found themselves under growing pressure. As powerful clans expanded their holdings, many independent farmers lost their land. Some were forced to become tenants, working the fields of wealthy landlords. Others abandoned agriculture entirely and migrated toward cities in search of work. This shift had profound consequences for the imperial treasury. Taxes in the Han system were based primarily on land ownership. When wealthy families accumulated large estates, they often found ways to evade or minimize taxation through political connections. Meanwhile, smaller farmers who still owned land were required to shoulder an increasing share of the financial burden. The state's revenue began to shrink, even as inequality grew. For the moment, the empire's prosperity masked these problems. Trade along the Silk Road was booming. Cities flourished. The imperial court continued to fund grand projects and military campaigns, but the structural imbalance was quietly expanding beneath the surface. And it was not the only threat emerging within the empire. Inside the imperial palace, a different kind of power struggle was unfolding. The Han emperors ruled from within elaborate palace complexes surrounded by layers of advisors, relatives, servants, and officials. Among the most influential of these figures were the eunuchs. Eunuchs were men who had been castrated, often in childhood, so they could serve within the inner palace. Because they could not produce heirs, they were considered safe companions for imperial women and trusted attendants to the emperor himself. Over time, eunuchs became indispensable to the functioning of the court. They controlled access to the emperor, managed palace communications, and handled sensitive administrative tasks. Their proximity to the ruler gave them enormous influence over political decisions. At first, their power remained limited, but as successive emperors grew younger or less capable, eunuchs began to expand their authority. They formed alliances with members of the imperial family, manipulated court appointments, and sometimes even dictated policy. Confucian officials viewed this development with alarm. To them, eunuchs represented a dangerous corruption of the natural order. In Confucian philosophy, proper governance depended on moral leadership by educated scholar officials. Eunuchs, by contrast, were palace servants who had gained influence through proximity rather than merit. Tensions between these two groups, eunuchs and scholar officials, began to escalate. The struggle would eventually become one of the most destructive political conflicts in the history of the dynasty. But during the golden years of Han prosperity, the conflict remained largely hidden behind palace walls. Beyond the capital, the empire continued to thrive. The expansion of the Silk Road brought new crops and technologies into China. Improved agricultural methods increased food production, allowing the population to grow. Iron tools and irrigation systems opened new lands for cultivation. Meanwhile, Chinese craftsmen produced goods of extraordinary quality: lacquerware, ceramics, metalwork, and silk textiles that traveled thousands of miles through international trade networks. The Han Empire had become a global economic powerhouse. Even the Roman Empire, far to the west, developed a fascination with Chinese silk. Roman writers complained that their citizens were spending enormous sums on luxury fabrics imported from mysterious eastern lands. The Han rulers were aware of this demand and took steps to protect their monopoly over silk production. The methods used to cultivate silkworms and weave silk thread were carefully guarded secrets. Anyone caught attempting to smuggle silkworms out of the empire faced severe punishment. The wealth generated by silk exports poured into imperial coffers and strengthened China's position within the emerging global economy. For a time, it seemed as if the Han Dynasty had discovered the perfect balance between technology, governance, and trade. But history rarely allows such balance to last. Because while the empire's cities glittered with prosperity, conditions in the countryside were slowly deteriorating. Land inequality was rising, tax burdens were shifting, and in distant provinces, local governors were beginning to accumulate power that rivaled the authority of the central government. The machine that had once unified the empire was starting to strain under its own complexity. and the first true cracks in the Han Dynasty's golden foundation were about to appear. For decades, the Han Empire appeared unstoppable. Its armies guarded the frontiers, its scholars governed the bureaucracy, and its markets overflowed with goods flowing along the Silk Road. Cities like Chang'an and Luoyang grew into centers of culture and administration, where officials debated philosophy while merchants negotiated prices for silk, jade, and lacquerware. Yet beneath this extraordinary surface, the machinery of the empire was beginning to malfunction. The problem was not a single catastrophe. It was a slow accumulation of pressures, economic, political, and social, that gradually destabilized the system that had once made the Han so powerful. And it began in the countryside. In theory, the Han government had built its economic structure around small, independent farmers. These farmers formed the backbone of the state. They cultivated land, paid taxes in grain and labor, and provided soldiers when the empire required military service. The stability of the dynasty depended on maintaining a large population of self-sufficient agricultural households. But reality rarely follows theory. Over time, the economic success of the empire began to produce an unintended consequence: the rise of enormous private estates. Powerful families accumulated land on a massive scale. Some purchased fields from struggling farmers during times of drought or famine. Others acquired land through political influence or marriage alliances. Gradually, vast estates emerged across northern and central China. These estates were often run like miniature kingdoms. Tenant farmers worked the land, producing grain for the estate owners rather than the imperial tax system. In many cases, these tenants were former small farmers who had fallen into debt or lost their property after poor harvests. For the aristocratic families who controlled these estates, the arrangement was extremely profitable. For the imperial government, it was disastrous, because land owned by powerful clans was often hidden from tax registers. Through connections within the bureaucracy, wealthy landowners found ways to avoid or reduce their obligations to the state. Meanwhile, independent farmers, those still listed in official records, continued to pay full taxes. The burden shifted downward. A growing number of ordinary farmers struggled under increasing demands from both landlords and government officials. And when hardship arrived, there was little protection left. Natural disasters were a constant feature of life in ancient China. Floods along the Yellow River could wipe out entire harvests. Drought could destroy crops for years at a time. Locust swarms sometimes devoured fields within hours. In earlier periods, the Han government had maintained extensive granary systems to stabilize the food supply. These state-controlled granaries stored surplus grain during good years and distributed it during times of famine. But as corruption spread through the bureaucracy, these systems began to weaken. Some officials siphoned off grain reserves for personal profit. Others neglected maintenance of irrigation systems and flood defenses. The consequences were devastating. When floods or drought struck regions already burdened by heavy taxes and landlord exploitation, entire communities collapsed. Farmers abandoned their fields, migrated to other provinces, or turned to banditry simply to survive. And each wave of rural instability weakened the foundations of the empire. Yet within the imperial capital, many of these problems remained invisible. The court was consumed by its own internal struggles. The power struggle between eunuchs and scholar officials had reached a dangerous level. Both factions claimed to represent the interests of the emperor. Both accused the other of corruption and manipulation. But their conflict had little to do with virtue. It was about control. The eunuchs possessed direct access to the emperor. They controlled palace gates, managed communications, and often served as personal attendants to young rulers who had ascended the throne before gaining political experience. Because of this proximity, eunuchs could influence imperial decisions in ways that frustrated the Confucian bureaucracy. Scholar officials, on the other hand, dominated the administrative system outside the palace. They managed taxation, legal systems, and provincial governance. Each side feared that the other might gain complete control of the state. The result was a series of bitter political purges. One of the most notorious incidents occurred in the 2nd century CE, during what historians later called the partisan prohibitions. Confucian officials accused certain eunuchs of corruption and demanded their removal from power. In response, eunuch factions persuaded the emperor that these officials were plotting rebellion. The outcome was brutal. Hundreds of scholar officials were arrested, exiled, or executed. Entire families were punished for the political activities of their relatives. The Confucian bureaucracy, once the moral backbone of the empire, was deeply shaken. Many talented administrators withdrew from government service altogether, fearing persecution. This exodus of capable officials further weakened the efficiency of the Han state. While the capital descended into factional intrigue, both the provinces began to change in ways that alarmed even loyal administrators. Provincial governors held enormous responsibility within the Han system. They supervised military forces, collected taxes, enforced imperial law, and maintained order across vast territories. In theory, these officials were appointed by the central government and could be removed at any time. But the reality was more complicated. As communication delays and political instability increased, provincial governors gained greater autonomy. Some remained loyal administrators who faithfully served the emperor. Others saw opportunity. By cultivating local alliances with powerful landowners and military commanders, certain governors began operating as independent rulers in all but name. They collected taxes for their own armies, they fortified cities and recruited soldiers whose loyalty was directed toward regional leaders rather than the imperial court. In peaceful times, these developments might have remained manageable, but the Han Empire was entering a period where peaceful times were becoming increasingly rare. By the late 2nd century CE, signs of systemic crisis were appearing across the empire. Population pressures strained agricultural land. Wealth inequality widened the gap between aristocrats and farmers. Corruption within the court weakened the government's ability to respond to emergencies. At the same time, new religious movements were beginning to emerge among the rural population. Many of these movements promised spiritual salvation during a time of suffering and uncertainty. One of them would soon ignite the largest rebellion the Han Dynasty had ever faced. Its followers wore yellow scarves tied around their heads, and when they rose in revolt, they would shake the empire to its core. By the late 2nd century CE, the Han Empire was no longer the confident superpower it had once been. The outward appearance of strength still remained. Imperial officials continued to record taxes, soldiers still patrolled frontier garrisons, and caravans still moved along the Silk Road carrying silk and spices across the deserts of Central Asia. But beneath this surface of stability, the countryside was unraveling. In village after village, farmers were struggling to survive. Heavy taxation had already strained their resources, but the true catastrophe came from the land itself. The Yellow River, both the lifeline and the curse of northern China, began to flood with increasing frequency. Entire regions saw their harvests destroyed as fields were swallowed by muddy water. Elsewhere, drought baked the earth until crops failed entirely. To farmers already burdened by taxes and rent payments to landlords, these disasters were devastating. Families that had worked their land for generations suddenly found themselves unable to produce enough grain to survive the winter. Many sold their tools, their livestock, and eventually their land in desperate attempts to pay debts. Once their land was gone, so was their independence. Some became tenant farmers working the estates of powerful clans. Others wandered the countryside as displaced laborers. Entire communities broke apart as famine and poverty spread across the provinces. The imperial government attempted to respond. Officials distributed grain from state granaries and reduced taxes in some regions. But corruption within the bureaucracy meant that aid rarely reached those who needed it most. In some cases, local officials diverted relief supplies for personal profit. For peasants already convinced that the ruling class had abandoned them, such abuses were unforgivable. And so the anger grew. At the same time, another force was beginning to spread quietly through the villages of northern China. It was not a political movement, at least not at first. It was a religion. The movement was led by a man named Zhang Jue. Little is known about his early life, but historical sources describe him as a healer and spiritual teacher who traveled through rural communities preaching a new religious message. Zhang Jue claimed to possess supernatural knowledge revealed to him through sacred texts. According to his teachings, the world had entered a period of cosmic imbalance. The Han Dynasty, he declared, had lost the mandate of heaven. In traditional Chinese belief, the mandate of heaven was the divine authority granted to emperors who governed justly. When rulers became corrupt or incompetent, heaven withdrew its support, allowing another dynasty to rise in its place. Zhang Jue's message resonated deeply with people who were already suffering under famine, taxation, and neglect. He promised that a new era was approaching, an era of equality, an era where suffering would end and heaven's order would be restored. His followers believed that the Han Dynasty was nearing its final days. Zhang Jue called his movement the Way of Great Peace. What began as a spiritual revival soon grew into something far more dangerous. The movement spread rapidly through the countryside. Zhang Jue and his brothers traveled across multiple provinces recruiting followers, healing the sick, and preaching their message of cosmic renewal. Peasants, farmers, laborers, and even some disillusioned officials joined their ranks. One of the reasons the movement expanded so quickly was its organization. Zhang Jue divided his followers into structured groups, each led by trusted disciples who reported directly to the central leadership. Communication between communities allowed the movement to coordinate across vast regions. By the early 1800s CE, tens of thousands of people had pledged loyalty to the cause. Many of them began wearing yellow cloth around their heads as a symbol of unity, and the color yellow carried deep symbolic meaning. In Chinese cosmology, yellow represented the earth, the center of the world, and the element associated with renewal and transformation. For Zhang Jue's followers, the yellow headscarves became a sign that a new age was about to begin. Meanwhile, inside the imperial court, the seriousness of the situation was barely understood. Reports of growing unrest reached the capital, but many officials dismissed the movement as a harmless religious sect. The empire had faced minor rebellions before. They were usually crushed quickly. But this time was different. The Yellow Turban movement had spent years preparing. Hidden networks of followers existed across multiple provinces. Secret messages circulated among local leaders, coordinating plans for a massive uprising. The goal was nothing less than the overthrow of the Han Dynasty. When the rebellion finally began in 184 CE, it erupted with astonishing speed. Across northern China, Yellow Turban followers launched simultaneous attacks on government offices, military garrisons, and wealthy estates. Entire towns fell into rebel hands almost overnight. Imperial officials were killed or driven from their posts. Grain stores were seized and redistributed to starving villagers. In many areas, the rebels were welcomed as liberators rather than invaders. The scale of the uprising stunned the imperial court. Within weeks, the rebellion had spread across 8 provinces, involving hundreds of thousands of fighters and supporters. For the first time in centuries, the Han Dynasty faced a threat that could destroy the empire itself. The imperial government responded with urgency. Armies were mobilized from across the empire. Provincial governors were ordered to raise troops and suppress the rebellion before it could spread further. But the government faced a major problem. The Han military had grown weaker over the decades. Earlier emperors had relied heavily on conscripted farmers to fill the ranks of their armies, but as land inequality increased and small farmers disappeared, the supply of reliable soldiers began to shrink. In response, many officials turned to a dangerous solution. They hired private militias. Local warlords and wealthy landowners began raising their own armies to fight the rebels. These militias were often better equipped and more loyal to their commanders than to the imperial government. At first, this strategy seemed effective. Experienced generals led these forces into battle against the Yellow Turban rebels. After months of brutal fighting, many of the major rebel strongholds were destroyed. Zhang Jue himself died during the early stages of the rebellion, possibly from illness. Without his leadership, the movement gradually lost its central coordination. By the end of the year, the imperial army had regained control over many regions. The rebellion had been suppressed. But the victory came at a terrible cost. The Han government had survived the uprising, yet in defeating the rebels, it had unintentionally unleashed forces that would soon prove even more dangerous. The warlords who had raised private armies were now powerful figures in their own right. Their soldiers were loyal to them personally, not to the emperor, and the empire's finances had been shattered. Suppressing the rebellion required enormous expenditures, and taxes were increased to pay soldiers and rebuild damaged infrastructure. Inflation began spreading through the economy as the government struggled to fund its operations. The people who had suffered through famine and rebellion now faced even greater hardship. Many believed that Zhang Jue had been right. Perhaps the Han Dynasty truly had lost the mandate of heaven, and if that was the case, then the rebellion of 184 CE had only been the beginning. Far worse conflicts were still to come. The Yellow Turban Rebellion had been crushed, or at least that was what the imperial court told itself. The rebel armies had been scattered, their leaders killed or captured, and the imperial banners once again flew above the cities that had briefly fallen into insurgent hands. Official reports declared the restoration of order. But beneath the surface, the rebellion had permanently changed the balance of power inside the Han Empire. The central government had survived. Yet it was no longer truly in control. In earlier centuries, the Han military had been carefully structured around the authority of the emperor. Generals were appointed by the court and rotated between assignments to prevent them from building personal power bases. The Yellow Turban crisis forced the government to abandon this system. The rebellion had erupted across such a vast area that the imperial army alone could not contain it. Provincial officials were ordered to raise troops quickly, any troops they could find. Local militias, private armies funded by wealthy families, and regional commanders all joined the fight. These forces proved effective. Experienced leaders emerged who were capable of organizing disciplined armies and defeating rebel groups that had seized entire regions. But these commanders soon discovered something that would reshape Chinese history. They were powerful. Once the rebellion began to fade, the armies they commanded did not simply disappear. Thousands of soldiers remained under their authority, and soldiers who fought under a general's banner tended to remain loyal to that general rather than to a distant emperor they had never seen. Across the empire, a new class of military leaders began to rise. They would soon be known as warlords. Among these emerging figures was a man whose name would become legendary in Chinese history: Cao Cao. At the beginning of the Yellow Turban Rebellion, Cao Cao was a relatively minor officer in the imperial administration. He had served in local government positions and had gained some reputation for intelligence and decisiveness. When the rebellion broke out, Cao Cao quickly proved himself capable in battle. He organized local forces and participated in several successful campaigns against Yellow Turban factions. His ability to command troops and manage logistics attracted attention within the imperial government. But Cao Cao's true strength was not simply military skill, it was strategy. While other generals focused on defeating rebels, Cao Cao began building a political and administrative base for himself. He recruited talented advisors, many of whom were Confucian scholars disillusioned with the corruption of the imperial court. These men helped Cao Cao develop a vision for restoring order in a collapsing empire. He reorganized farmland under his control into a system known as Tuntian, where soldiers and displaced peasants worked state-owned land to produce food for the army. This policy served two purposes. It stabilized agricultural production in war-torn regions and ensured that Cao Cao's forces remained well supplied. In an empire where famine and economic instability were spreading, such policies gave him a powerful advantage. Gradually, Cao Cao transformed from a government officer into one of the most influential military leaders in northern China, and he was far from the only one. Elsewhere, other commanders were carving out their own territories. Generals like Yuan Shao, Liu Biao, and Dong Zhuo commanded large armies and governed provinces as personal domains. Many of them claimed loyalty to the Han Emperor, but their actions increasingly resembled those of independent rulers. Among them, one figure would soon plunge the empire into chaos: Dong Zhuo. Dong Zhuo was a general from the northwest frontier, a region known for producing tough and battle-hardened soldiers. His troops were loyal and experienced, having spent years fighting nomadic tribes along China's borders. When political turmoil erupted in the imperial capital during the late 180 CE, Dong Zhuo saw an opportunity. At the time, the Han court was already deeply divided by factional conflict. Eunuchs and scholar officials were locked in bitter struggles for influence over the emperor. Political assassinations and purges had become disturbingly common. In 189 CE, tensions exploded. A group of high-ranking officials and generals conspired to eliminate the powerful eunuch faction once and for all. They invited regional military commanders to bring their troops to the capital in order to intimidate the eunuchs into surrender. Among those invited was Dong Zhuo. The plan quickly spiraled out of control. Before the conspirators could act, the eunuchs discovered the plot and assassinated one of the leading officials involved. Panic spread through the capital as rival factions mobilized their supporters. Soon, violence erupted within the palace itself. The eunuchs kidnapped the young emperor and attempted to flee the city. Loyalist forces pursued them, and in the chaos, the emperor was rescued, but the palace administration had completely collapsed. Amid this turmoil, Dong Zhuo arrived at the capital with his army. What followed was a coup. Dong Zhuo quickly seized control of the imperial court. Using his military power, he forced the young emperor to abdicate and replaced him with a puppet ruler more easily controlled. Officials who resisted his authority were executed or driven into exile. The capital itself was soon subjected to brutal treatment. Dong Zhuo ruled through fear. He executed political rivals, confiscated property from wealthy families, and placed loyal followers in key government positions. His soldiers looted parts of the city, creating an atmosphere of terror among the population. The once glorious Han capital had become a hostage to military dictatorship. Yet Dongzhuo's rule would not last long. His actions outraged other warlords across the empire. In response to Dongzhuo's takeover, a coalition of regional commanders formed an alliance to overthrow him. Leaders such as Yuan Shao and Cao Cao joined forces, gathering armies to march against the capital. This alliance marked a turning point in Chinese history. For the first time, the empire's most powerful military leaders were openly fighting each other. The struggle was no longer simply about restoring order or suppressing rebellion. It had become a competition for control of the entire state. As armies marched and alliances shifted, the authority of the Han Emperor continued to weaken. Even after Dongzhuo was eventually assassinated by one of his own officers in 192 CE, the empire did not recover. Instead, the warlords who had risen during the rebellion began competing for dominance. China was fragmenting. The once unified administrative system of the Han Dynasty was breaking apart under the pressure of regional ambition and military conflict. And as rival armies prepared for even larger battles, one thing became increasingly clear. The Han Dynasty, the dynasty that had once created one of the most advanced civilizations on Earth, was approaching its final chapter. By the early 3rd century, the Han Empire still existed, at least in name. The imperial seal still stamped official documents. The emperor still sat upon the throne, surrounded by the ceremonial rituals that had defined Chinese rulership for centuries. But the reality was painfully clear. The emperor no longer ruled the empire. Power had shifted to the warlords. Across China, rival military leaders controlled vast territories, commanding armies larger than anything the imperial court could muster. They collected taxes, appointed officials, and governed provinces as if they were sovereign states. The Han Dynasty had not yet collapsed, but it had already lost control. Among the warlords struggling for dominance, Cao Cao was emerging as one of the most formidable. After years of military campaigns against both rebels and rival generals, he had consolidated control over large portions of northern China. His territory included fertile farmland and several important cities, providing both economic strength and strategic advantage. But Cao Cao understood something that many of his rivals did not. Military power alone was not enough. To truly control the empire, he needed legitimacy, and legitimacy still belonged to the Han Emperor. At the time, the emperor was a young ruler named Emperor Xian, a man who had spent most of his life as a pawn in the struggles of powerful officials and generals. After the chaos caused by Dongzhuo's coup and assassination, the emperor had been left vulnerable and politically isolated. In 196 CE, Cao Cao made a decisive move. He brought the emperor under his protection. Officially, Cao Cao declared that he was rescuing the emperor from disorder and restoring the authority of the Han court. In practice, the situation was very different. By controlling the emperor, Cao Cao gained something even more powerful than military strength. He gained the ability to rule in the emperor's name. Imperial decrees issued by the court were now effectively controlled by Cao Cao. Orders to appoint officials, mobilize troops, or punish rivals all carried the legitimacy of the Han throne, even though they served Cao Cao's interests. This strategy allowed him to present himself not as a usurper, but as the loyal defender of the dynasty. Many scholars and administrators accepted this arrangement. After years of chaos, they believed that Cao Cao might be the only leader capable of restoring order to the empire. But other warlords were not so easily convinced. They saw Cao Cao's control of the emperor as a dangerous consolidation of power, and they began preparing to challenge him. The most powerful of these rivals was Yuan Shao. Yuan Shao came from one of the most prestigious aristocratic families in China. His lineage had produced generations of high-ranking officials, and his reputation among the elite was formidable. He also commanded a massive army. Yuan Shao controlled large territories north of the Yellow River, with access to abundant agricultural resources and thousands of soldiers. For several years, tensions between Yuan Shao and Cao Cao continued to grow. Both leaders understood that the empire could not remain divided forever. Eventually, one of them would have to prevail. That moment came in the year 200 CE at a place called Guandu. The Battle of Guandu would become one of the most decisive military confrontations in Chinese history. Yuan Shao's forces vastly outnumbered those of Cao Cao. Historical accounts suggest that Yuan Shao may have commanded an army several times larger than his rivals, but numbers alone do not determine victory. Cao Cao's strength lay in strategy. Rather than confronting Yuan Shao's massive army in a direct assault, Cao Cao used mobility and intelligence to exploit weaknesses in his opponent's logistics. He launched a surprise attack on Yuan Shao's supply depots, destroying the food reserves that sustained the larger army. The effect was catastrophic. Without supplies, Yuan Shao's forces began to collapse. Confusion spread among his troops, and Cao Cao's army seized the opportunity to strike. The battle ended in a decisive victory for Cao Cao. Yuan Shao's power was broken. Within a few years, Cao Cao had absorbed much of his rival's territory, becoming the dominant warlord of northern China. But while Cao Cao consolidated his power in the north, other leaders were rising in different parts of the empire. In the fertile lands of the Yangtze River Valley, a young warlord named Sun Quan was establishing his own stronghold. Sun Quan inherited leadership from his older brother, Sun Si, who had built a powerful regional state in the southeast. Under Sun Quan's leadership, this territory grew into a prosperous and well-defended domain. Further west, another figure was beginning to gain attention: Liu Bei. Unlike Cao Cao or Yuan Shao, Liu Bei did not come from great wealth or powerful aristocratic connections. In fact, his early life was marked by hardship and wandering. Yet Liu Bei possessed something that many others lacked: charisma. He presented himself as a defender of the Han Dynasty and a champion of the common people. His claim to distant imperial ancestry gave him a symbolic connection to the Han royal family, and his reputation for loyalty attracted talented followers. Among those followers was one of the most celebrated strategists in Chinese history, Zhuge Liang. Zhuge Liang was a scholar known for his extraordinary intelligence and political insight. When Liu Bei sought him out and persuaded him to join his cause, he gained an advisor who would help shape the future of the region. Together, these leaders were laying the foundations for three competing centers of power: Cao Cao in the north, Sun Quan in the southeast, Liu Bei in the west. The Han Dynasty still existed in name, but the empire was now divided among warlords whose ambitions could no longer be contained by imperial authority. By the early 3rd century, the political landscape of China had transformed completely. The centralized bureaucracy that had once governed millions of people was crumbling under the strain of constant warfare. Provincial governors had become independent rulers. Armies loyal to rival commanders marched across the countryside. The emperor remained a symbol of legitimacy, but symbols alone could not restore unity. The empire that had once pioneered paper, iron technology, and global trade was now sliding toward fragmentation. And soon the final act of the Han Dynasty would unfold. Because the struggle between these three rising powers was about to ignite one of the most famous battles in Chinese history, a battle that would determine the fate of the entire empire. The Battle of Red Cliffs. By the winter of 208 CE, the struggle for control of China had reached a critical point. Cao Cao had already secured dominance across the northern half of the empire. After defeating Yuan Shao and absorbing his territories, Cao Cao now commanded vast resources, millions of people, fertile farmland, and a massive army hardened by years of warfare. To many observers, it seemed inevitable that he would soon reunify China under his authority. Only one obstacle remained: the lands south of the Yangtze River. These regions were controlled by the warlord Sun Quan, whose state had grown prosperous along the river's fertile plains and coastal ports. Sun Quan's forces were experienced in river warfare and familiar with the geography of the south. But compared to Cao Cao's enormous northern army, they were still heavily outnumbered. If Cao Cao succeeded in crossing the Yangtze River, the last major resistance to his rule would collapse. Yet another figure was entering the stage: Liu Bei. At this point in his life, Liu Bei had endured years of uncertainty. He had fought alongside various commanders, lost territories, rebuilt alliances, and searched constantly for a place where he could establish a stable base of power. His followers remained loyal, but his military strength was far smaller than that of Cao Cao or Sun Quan. Still, Liu Bei possessed something that neither of them fully controlled: legitimacy. He claimed descent from the imperial Liu family that had founded the Han Dynasty centuries earlier. To those who believed that the Han still represented the rightful authority of China, Liu Bei symbolized the continuation of that legacy. When Cao Cao's armies advanced southward, Liu Bei found himself forced into retreat. Entire cities fell as Cao Cao's forces swept through central China. And refugees fled in enormous numbers, seeking protection from the advancing army. Eventually, Liu Bei realized that he could not face Cao Cao alone. He needed an ally, and the only ally powerful enough to balance Cao Cao's might was Sun Quan. Sun Quan faced a difficult decision. Some of his advisors believed that resistance against Cao Cao was hopeless. They argued that surrendering to Cao Cao would preserve their territory and avoid the destruction of war. But others disagreed. One of Sun Quan's most trusted commanders, Zhou Yu, believed that Cao Cao's army, despite its size, had serious weaknesses. Many of Cao Cao's soldiers were northern infantry who had little experience fighting on rivers. The Yangtze River, with its wide currents and complex waterways, favored defenders who understood naval warfare. Furthermore, Cao Cao's army had recently marched thousands of miles southward. Many soldiers were exhausted and unfamiliar with the humid climate of the region. Disease was spreading through the ranks. Zhou Yu argued that if Sun Quan joined forces with Liu Bei, they might have a chance. After careful deliberation, Sun Quan made his choice. He would fight. The alliance between Sun Quan and Liu Bei was sealed, creating a coalition army determined to stop Cao Cao's advance. Their battlefield would be a stretch of the Yangtze River known as Red Cliffs. The Battle of Red Cliffs became one of the most famous military engagements in Chinese history. Cao Cao's army was enormous. Some historical records claim he commanded hundreds of thousands of soldiers, although modern historians believe the number was likely smaller. Even so, Cao Cao's forces still significantly outnumbered the combined armies of Sun Quan and Liu Bei, but the geography of the battlefield would play a decisive role. Cao Cao had assembled a large fleet of ships to transport his army across the Yangtze River. Many of his soldiers, however, were not accustomed to life aboard ships. The constant movement of the vessels made them seasick. To stabilize the fleet, Cao Cao ordered his ships chained together into large floating formations. At first glance, this seemed like a practical solution. In reality, it created a fatal vulnerability. Zhou Yu and his advisors carefully studied the situation. They knew that if they attempted to attack Cao Cao's fleet directly, they would likely be overwhelmed by the sheer number of enemy troops. Instead, they devised a plan: fire. The Yangtze River's winter winds often blew steadily from the southeast toward the northwest, the direction where Cao Cao's fleet was anchored. If fire could be launched against the chained ships, the flames would spread rapidly across the entire formation. But to execute such an attack, the Allied forces would need to deceive Cao Cao. This deception came through a daring maneuver by a commander named Huang Gai. Huang Gai pretended to defect. He sent a message to Cao Cao claiming that he was dissatisfied with Sun Quan's leadership and wished to surrender. Cao Cao, believing he had gained an important ally within the enemy ranks, welcomed the defection. Soon afterward, Huang Gai sailed toward Cao Cao's fleet with several ships supposedly carrying tribute. As the vessels approached the chained armada, the wind began to shift. At the critical moment, Huang Gai's ships revealed their true purpose. They were filled with oil, dry reeds, and other flammable materials. Torches were lit. The burning ships were released and driven by the wind directly into Cao Cao's fleet. Because the vessels were chained together, the fire spread instantly. Flames leapt from ship to ship as explosions of burning oil engulfed the tightly packed armada. Panic erupted among Cao Cao's soldiers. Many tried to escape by jumping into the river, only to drown or be struck by enemy arrows. Others attempted to cut the chains binding the ships, but the fire spread too quickly. Within hours, Cao Cao's fleet was reduced to a blazing inferno. The defeat at Red Cliffs was catastrophic. Cao Cao's surviving forces retreated northward in disarray. Disease and exhaustion continued to ravage the army during its long march home. The dream of quickly conquering southern China had been shattered. For the first time, Cao Cao faced a strategic reality he could not easily overcome. The Yangtze River had become a permanent barrier. The empire was now divided. The victory at Red Cliffs allowed Sun Quan and Liu Bei to secure their territories in the south. Sun Quan strengthened his hold over the southeastern provinces, establishing a powerful state that controlled the Yangtze River delta and key maritime trade routes. Liu Bei moved westward into the fertile Sichuan Basin, where he eventually established his own kingdom centered around the region of Shu. Meanwhile, Cao Cao remained the dominant power in the north. China was no longer a single empire. It had become a landscape of rival states. Although the Han Emperor still occupied the throne, his authority was now largely symbolic. The warlords had effectively carved the empire into competing realms, and soon even the fragile illusion of Han rule would disappear. Because the man who controlled the emperor, Cao Cao, was preparing to transform his power into something far greater: a new dynasty. After the Battle of Red Cliffs, the Han Empire entered its final and most fragile stage. The illusion of unity still lingered. The emperor still issued decrees from the capital, and the bureaucratic system that had once governed millions of people continued to operate in fragments across the land. But the truth was impossible to hide. China had already fractured. Three major powers now dominated the political landscape. Cao Cao ruled the vast northern plains. Sun Quan controlled the rich lands along the Yangtze River delta, and Liu Bei had begun establishing authority in the mountainous southwest. Each leader governed as if he were the ruler of a separate state. The Han Emperor remained on the throne, yet he possessed almost no real authority. And everyone understood that this situation could not last forever. Cao Cao remained the most powerful figure in China. After Red Cliffs, he returned to the north and continued strengthening his control over the empire's most productive territories. His administration in the northern capital was efficient and disciplined, supported by talented advisors and capable generals. Unlike many warlords, Cao Cao did not simply rely on brute force. He actively rebuilt systems of governance. Under his leadership, abandoned farmland was restored through the Tuntian agricultural system, which allowed soldiers and displaced peasants to cultivate state land in exchange for protection and food. This policy stabilized northern agriculture and ensured a steady supply of grain for the army. He also recruited scholars and administrators who had once served the Han bureaucracy. Many of these men had become disillusioned with the corruption of the imperial court. Under Cao Cao, they found a new opportunity to restore order and rebuild government institutions. Despite this effort to maintain stability, one thing was increasingly clear. Cao Cao was no longer simply a loyal servant of the Han. He had become something far greater. In 213 CE, Cao Cao received a new title from the emperor. He was declared Duke of Wei. This was more than a ceremonial honor. The title granted him control over a semi-autonomous territory within the empire, along with the authority to govern it according to his own administrative structure. 7 years later, his power expanded even further. In 216 CE, Cao Cao was elevated to the rank of King of Wei. Kingship was a title rarely granted within the Han political system. It placed Cao Cao in a position just below the emperor himself. To many observers, this development seemed like the final step before the creation of a new dynasty. Yet Cao Cao never officially claimed the imperial throne. Some historians believe he chose restraint because he feared provoking rebellion among those still loyal to the Han. Others argue that he preferred to rule from behind the facade of imperial legitimacy. Whatever the reason, Cao Cao maintained the appearance of loyalty to the Han emperor until the end of his life. But the empire was already changing, and when Cao Cao died in 220 CE, the final transformation would arrive swiftly. Cao Cao's death marked the end of an era. For decades, he had been the central figure shaping northern China's political landscape. His authority, intelligence, and military success had allowed him to dominate the empire without formally overthrowing the Han Dynasty. His successor, however, had different ambitions. Cao Cao's son, Cao Pi, inherited his father's position as King of Wei. Unlike his father, Cao Pi had little interest in maintaining the illusion of Han authority. By this point, the emperor had become little more than a symbolic figurehead. The once powerful dynasty that had ruled China for 4 centuries was exhausted by internal corruption, rebellion, and war. Cao Pi recognized the opportunity. Later that same year, he made his move. In 220 CE, Cao Pi forced Emperor Xian to abdicate the throne. The abdication followed a familiar ritual within Chinese political tradition. According to the official narrative, the emperor voluntarily stepped down after recognizing that heaven's favor had shifted to a new ruler. The mandate of heaven, it was said, had passed from the Han Dynasty to the House of Cao. Of course, the reality was far less poetic. The emperor had no real choice. With Cao Pi controlling the armies, the court, and the administration of northern China, resistance was impossible. The Han Dynasty officially came to an end. Cao Pi declared himself the first emperor of a new state, the Wei Dynasty. The fall of the Han Dynasty marked the end of one of the most influential periods in Chinese history. For more than 4 centuries, the Han had governed a vast and complex empire. They had pioneered technological innovations, expanded trade networks across continents, and established administrative systems that would shape Chinese governance for centuries. Yet their collapse demonstrated a harsh truth about power. Even the most sophisticated political systems can be undone by internal decay. Corruption within the court, inequality in the countryside, and the rise of regional military leaders had slowly eroded the foundations of Han authority. By the time Cao Pi claimed the throne, the dynasty had already lost the strength needed to resist. But the story was not finished, because the fall of the Han Dynasty did not bring peace. It opened the door to a new era of conflict. And Cao Pi's new Wei dynasty controlled the northern heartland of China. But the other warlords were not prepared to accept his claim to imperial authority. In the West, Liu Bei still presented himself as the legitimate heir of the Han royal family. To him, Cao Pi's takeover was not a rightful transfer of the mandate of heaven, it was a betrayal. In the southeast, Sun Quan governed a powerful and prosperous state along the Yangtze River. Both leaders understood that the balance of power was about to shift once again. Within a year of Cao Pi's declaration, Liu Bei responded by proclaiming himself emperor of a new state, the Han Dynasty, claiming to continue the legacy of the fallen Han Empire. Sun Quan would soon establish his own kingdom as well, the state of Wu. China was now divided into three rival empires: Wei in the north, Shu in the west, Wu in the south. This period would become known as the Three Kingdoms era, a time of legendary battles, political intrigue, and heroic figures that would later inspire centuries of literature and folklore. But beneath the romance of these stories lay a deeper historical reality. The golden age of the Han Dynasty was over, and the long struggle that followed would reshape China for generations to come. When the Han Dynasty finally collapsed in 220 CE, the event did not simply end a ruling family. It ended an entire era of Chinese civilization. For more than 4 centuries, the Han had governed one of the most sophisticated states in the ancient world. Their empire stretched across vast landscapes of farmland, mountains, rivers, and deserts. Within that territory lived tens of millions of people whose lives were connected through a complex system of administration, trade, technology, and culture. Yet even after the dynasty itself disappeared, the structures it had created did not vanish. In fact, many of them survived the fall of the empire and continued shaping Chinese civilization for nearly 2,000 years. The Han Dynasty had collapsed, but the Han system endured. One of the most important legacies of the Han was the idea of a centralized bureaucratic government. Before the Han, earlier dynasties had experimented with various forms of administration. The Qin dynasty, for example, had created a highly centralized state with standardized laws and systems of governance. But the Qin approach relied heavily on harsh punishments and rigid control. The Han rulers refined this model. They combined centralized administration with the moral philosophy of Confucianism, creating a government system built around educated officials rather than hereditary aristocrats. This was revolutionary. Under the Han system, scholars who mastered classical texts could be recommended for positions within the imperial bureaucracy. These officials then governed provinces, managed taxation, supervised infrastructure projects, and reported directly to the central government. Although the full imperial examination system would not appear until later dynasties, the foundations were laid during the Han period. For the first time in Chinese history, intellectual ability and education began to outweigh noble birth as the path to political power. This concept would define Chinese governance for centuries. Dynasties that followed the Han, from the Tang to the Song, and even the Ming and Qing, would continue refining and expanding this bureaucratic tradition. The empire might collapse, but the administrative model remained. Another enduring legacy of the Han Dynasty was technological innovation. During the Han period, Chinese engineers, craftsmen, and scholars developed tools and inventions that dramatically transformed daily life. Among the most important of these innovations was paper. Although early forms of paper existed before the Han, the court official Kai Lun is credited with refining the production process around the year 105 CE. By combining plant fibers, tree bark, hemp, and rags into a pulp that could be pressed and dried into thin sheets, he created a writing material that was inexpensive and easy to produce. Before paper, official records had been written on bamboo strips or silk. Bamboo was durable but heavy. Silk was lightweight but extremely expensive. Paper solved both problems. It was cheap, flexible, and easy to store. For a bureaucracy managing millions of people, this innovation was transformative. Government offices could now record tax registers, legal documents, and administrative reports more efficiently than ever before. Scholars could copy and distribute texts more easily, and helping spread knowledge across the empire. Over time, paper would revolutionize education, literature, and communication throughout the world, but its origins lay in the bureaucratic needs of the Han state. Iron technology was another cornerstone of Han innovation. While earlier societies had used bronze tools and weapons, the Han Dynasty dramatically expanded the production of iron. Government-controlled foundries produced large quantities of iron plows, axes, sickles, and other agricultural tools. These tools allowed farmers to cultivate land more efficiently, especially in regions where hard soil had previously limited farming. The results were significant. Agricultural productivity increased, allowing the empire's population to grow. Iron technology also strengthened the Han military. Iron weapons and armor gave soldiers advantages in combat, while advanced crossbow designs improved battlefield effectiveness. But iron tools had perhaps their greatest impact in the countryside. By improving farming efficiency, they supported the agricultural base that sustained the empire. In many ways, the Han Dynasty's technological success came from its ability to integrate innovation directly into everyday life. The Han period also saw remarkable developments in science and engineering. One of the most famous inventions of the era was the seismograph created by the scholar Zhang Heng in the 2nd century CE. Zhang Heng's device could detect distant earthquakes by measuring subtle vibrations in the ground. The instrument used a system of bronze balls and dragon-shaped mechanisms that would drop when seismic waves arrived from specific directions. Although the technology might appear simple by modern standards, it represented a profound understanding of natural forces. It demonstrated that Han scholars were not only administrators and philosophers, but also observers of the natural world. Astronomy, mathematics, and medicine all advanced during this period. Han astronomers mapped the movements of stars and planets with increasing precision. Physicians recorded medical knowledge that would later influence traditional Chinese medicine for centuries. These scientific developments reflected a broader intellectual culture that valued observation, documentation, and systematic thinking. Once again, the bureaucratic structure of the empire played a role. Because officials were required to record information about agriculture, weather, population, and taxation, the Han state generated enormous quantities of data about the natural and social world. This environment encouraged inquiry and innovation. Culturally, the Han Dynasty also left a powerful legacy. Confucian philosophy became deeply embedded within Chinese society during this period. The values of loyalty, respect for hierarchy, filial piety, and moral leadership became guiding principles for both government and family life. These ideas shaped not only political institutions, but also social expectations. Even after the fall of the Han, Confucian thought remained central to Chinese culture. Later dynasties would continue teaching Confucian classics in government academies and selecting officials based on their mastery of these texts. The influence of these ideas extended far beyond politics. They shaped education, family relationships, and ethical values across East Asia. Perhaps the most striking legacy of the Han Dynasty lies in something even more enduring: identity. The majority ethnic group in modern China refers to itself as the Han people. This name is not accidental. It reflects the profound cultural influence of the dynasty that once unified the region and established many of its foundational traditions. Language, customs, political philosophy, and historical memory all trace their roots back to the Han period. Even today, the phrase Han culture is used to describe the shared heritage of Chinese civilization. Few dynasties in world history have left such a lasting imprint on the identity of a people. Yet the story of the Han Dynasty also carries a warning. For all its achievements, its technological breakthroughs, its administrative brilliance, its global trade networks, the empire ultimately collapsed. The same system that enabled extraordinary innovation also created vulnerabilities. Wealth inequality, court corruption, political factionalism, and neglect of the rural population slowly eroded the foundations of the state. By the time rebellion and warlords emerged, the empire had already been weakened from within. The fall of the Han was not sudden. It was the final stage of a long process. And in the centuries that followed, Chinese historians would study that process carefully. Because the rise and fall of the Han Dynasty offered lessons that every future ruler needed to understand. Lessons about power, about responsibility, and about the fragile balance that sustains even the greatest empires. When historians describe the Han Dynasty as a golden age of innovation, they are not exaggerating. Few periods in ancient history produced such a combination of technological creativity, scientific curiosity, and administrative experimentation. The Han Empire was not simply expanding its territory or maintaining political order. It was actively transforming how people lived, worked, studied, and understood the world around them. These innovations were not isolated discoveries made by a handful of scholars. They were part of a broader cultural system that encouraged observation, documentation, and practical invention. At the center of that system stood the Han government itself. The Han state was an enormous administrative machine, responsible for managing tens of millions of people scattered across vast distances. Officials needed reliable information about crop production, population changes, taxation, weather patterns, and transportation routes. To gather and organize this information, the government required tools. This need for efficiency became a powerful driver of innovation. One example was the development of improved road and transportation systems. The Han Dynasty inherited a network of roads from the earlier Qin rulers, who had constructed highways to move armies and officials quickly across the empire. The Han expanded and refined these routes, connecting distant provinces with the capital through carefully maintained roads. Relay stations were built along major routes where government messengers could change horses and rest. These stations functioned as the communication arteries of the empire. Imperial messages could travel hundreds of kilometers in a matter of days, a remarkable achievement for the ancient world. The same infrastructure also supported trade. Merchants, travelers, and diplomats moved along these roads, linking China's interior to frontier markets and Silk Road trading hubs. Transportation became one of the foundations of Han prosperity. Urban life also flourished during this period. Cities under the Han Dynasty were carefully planned and organized. And major urban centers, such as Chang'an and Luoyang, were divided into districts designed for specific purposes: residential areas, government offices, markets, and workshops. Chang'an, the capital for much of the dynasty, was one of the largest cities on Earth at the time. Its population may have exceeded 500,000 people, making it larger than many cities in the Roman Empire. The city's streets were wide and laid out in a grid pattern, allowing for efficient movement of people and goods. All markets operated under strict regulation by government officials. Merchants sold everything from locally produced ceramics to exotic imports carried along the Silk Road, spices from Central Asia, gemstones from distant mountains, and rare animals brought by foreign envoys could all be found within the bustling market districts. For many visitors, the capital represented the wealth and sophistication of the entire empire. But urban life was not limited to trade. Cities also became centers of intellectual and artistic activity. Literature flourished during the Han Dynasty. Scholars compiled historical records, philosophical treatises, and poetry that would shape Chinese literary tradition for centuries. One of the most important works of this period was the Records of the Grand Historian, written by the historian Sima Qian. Sima Qian's monumental work attempted to document the entire history of China from ancient mythological rulers to his own era. It combined biography, political analysis, and detailed narrative in a way that had never been attempted before. The result was more than a history book. It became a model for how Chinese historians would record the past for the next 2,000 years. Sima Qian's work also revealed something important about Han intellectual culture. The pursuit of knowledge was not limited to philosophy or governance. It extended to history itself. By documenting the successes and failures of earlier rulers, historians hoped to guide future leaders toward wiser decisions. Scientific inquiry also advanced significantly during the Han period. Astronomy was particularly important. In ancient China, astronomical observations were closely tied to political legitimacy. The emperor was believed to rule under the mandate of heaven, and unusual celestial events, such as comets or eclipses, were often interpreted as signs that heaven was either approving or warning the ruler. As a result, Han astronomers carefully observed the skies. They mapped constellations, recorded planetary movements, and developed increasingly sophisticated calendars to track seasonal changes. These observations helped farmers plan agricultural activities and allowed the government to coordinate festivals and official ceremonies. In many ways, astronomy served as both a scientific discipline and a political tool. Medicine also progressed during this era. Han physicians compiled medical texts that described the human body, disease symptoms, and treatment methods. These texts emphasized balance within the body, a concept that would later become central to traditional Chinese medicine. Herbal remedies were widely used, and doctors experimented with combinations of plants to treat different illnesses. Acupuncture, the practice of inserting fine needles into specific points on the body, also gained wider recognition during this time. Although many of these medical theories differed from modern scientific understanding, they represented serious attempts to analyze health and disease systematically. The Han Dynasty encouraged such inquiry by preserving written records of treatments and observations. Paper once again played a crucial role. Because medical knowledge could now be recorded and shared more easily, physicians across the empire were able to build upon each other's discoveries. Technological innovation extended beyond science and medicine. Han engineers also developed remarkable mechanical devices. One example was the wheelbarrow, which allowed a single worker to transport heavy loads that would otherwise require multiple laborers. This invention dramatically improved efficiency in construction and agriculture. Another innovation was the chain pump, a mechanical device used to lift water from rivers or canals into irrigation systems. The chain pump helped farmers move water into fields located above river level, expanding the amount of land that could be cultivated. Such inventions may appear simple compared to modern machines, but in an agricultural society, they had enormous impact. They increased food production, reduced labor demands, and supported population growth across the empire. All of these innovations, paper, iron tools, scientific instruments, agricultural machines, formed part of a larger pattern. The Han Dynasty was building an interconnected system where technology, administration, and culture reinforced each other. Bureaucracy generated demand for record-keeping. Paper made record-keeping efficient. Agricultural tools increased productivity. Higher productivity supported population growth. A larger population required better administration. The cycle continued. For centuries, this system allowed the Han Empire to maintain stability while expanding its influence across East Asia and beyond. But systems built on complexity often contain hidden vulnerabilities, because when one part begins to fail, the entire structure can start to unravel. And by the late Han period, those failures were already becoming impossible to ignore. The same empire that had pioneered so many innovations was beginning to suffer from corruption, inequality, and political paralysis. The golden age of Han brilliance was approaching its twilight, and the forces that would bring the dynasty to its final collapse were already gathering. By the late 2nd century CE, the Han Dynasty was no longer the confident empire that had once dominated East Asia. From the outside, its institutions still existed. The emperor still sat upon the throne, the bureaucracy still recorded taxes and issued decrees, and the army still defended distant frontiers. But the internal balance that had sustained the empire for centuries was breaking down. The Han system had always depended on a delicate relationship between the central government and the countryside. Farmers produced grain. Grain supported the population and funded the imperial treasury through taxes. Those taxes paid officials, soldiers, engineers, and the vast administrative network that held the empire together. When that relationship weakened, the entire structure began to wobble. And by the late Han period, that relationship was collapsing. The problem began with land. As the empire grew wealthier during its golden age, powerful aristocratic families steadily expanded their estates. What had once been modest holdings grew into enormous agricultural domains spanning entire regions. These estates operated with remarkable efficiency. Large landowners could afford irrigation systems, on storage facilities, and teams of laborers who worked the fields year-round. Their harvests were often larger than those produced by small independent farmers, but efficiency came with a cost. The Han tax system had originally been designed to collect revenue from millions of small landholders scattered across the countryside. Each household paid taxes in grain, labor service, or military duty. When land gradually shifted into the hands of wealthy clans, this system began to break down. Large estates often avoided taxation through political influence or manipulation of government records. Powerful families had relatives within the bureaucracy who could alter land registers or overlook irregularities. Some estates were officially listed under the names of tenant farmers, disguising the true scale of elite land ownership. As a result, enormous amounts of agricultural production escaped the tax system entirely. Meanwhile, the remaining independent farmers, those who still owned small plots of land, were required to shoulder an increasing share of the state's financial burden. The result was predictable. Many small farmers could not survive under the pressure. Debt became widespread across rural communities. When harvests failed due to drought, floods, or locust swarms, farmers often borrowed grain or money from wealthy landowners. These loans carried heavy interest. If the borrower could not repay the debt, the consequences were severe. Land was forfeited. Families who had worked the same fields for generations suddenly became tenant laborers working the estates of their former creditors. Some farmers fled their homes entirely, abandoning agriculture and migrating toward towns or frontier regions in search of survival. Every such loss weakened the tax base of the Han state. Because the government relied on registered households to collect taxes and labor obligations. When families lost their land or disappeared from official records, the treasury lost revenue. This created a vicious cycle. As government income declined, officials increased taxes on the remaining farmers, which forced even more families into poverty. At the same time, corruption within the bureaucracy was growing more severe. The Han administrative system had once been admired for its efficiency and professionalism. Educated officials trained in Confucian ethics were expected to govern with fairness and discipline. But over time, political factionalism eroded these ideals. The bitter rivalry between eunuchs and scholar officials inside the imperial court had already damaged the credibility of the government. Purges and accusations of treason had driven many capable administrators away from public service. Those who remained often focused more on political survival than effective governance. Some officials used their positions to enrich themselves through bribery or illegal taxation. Others simply ignored problems in their districts, fearing that any failure might attract punishment from rival factions within the court. The result was administrative paralysis. Local communities suffering from famine or economic collapse often received little help from the government, and as frustration grew among the population, resentment toward the ruling elite deepened. Communication between the capital and distant provinces also began to deteriorate. In theory, the Han bureaucracy maintained strict oversight of regional administrators. Governors were required to submit regular reports detailing tax revenue, population statistics, and local conditions. But the empire was enormous. Messages traveling by horseback could take weeks or even months to reach the capital. During times of crisis, this delay made effective response nearly impossible. Provincial governors increasingly relied on their own judgment rather than waiting for instructions from the central government. Some remained loyal to the emperor. Others began operating as independent authorities. These governors commanded local armies, collected taxes, and maintained alliances with powerful landowning families in their regions. Gradually, the distinction between imperial officials and regional warlords began to blur. By the time the Yellow Turban Rebellion erupted, many provinces were already functioning as semi-autonomous territories. Economic instability was not the only threat facing the empire. Environmental disasters also intensified the crisis. The Yellow River, which had nourished Chinese agriculture for centuries, was notorious for its unpredictable floods. When its waters overflowed their banks, entire villages could disappear beneath thick layers of mud. Repeated floods destroyed farmland and displaced thousands of people. Droughts brought equally devastating consequences. Without irrigation or rainfall, crops failed, and food shortages spread rapidly through rural communities. The Han government had once maintained extensive public works programs to manage these environmental risks. Dikes, canals, and irrigation systems helped regulate water flow and protect farmland. But as the imperial treasury weakened and corruption spread among local officials, many of these infrastructure systems fell into disrepair. Flood control became less reliable. Irrigation networks deteriorated. Natural disasters that might once have been manageable turned into full-scale humanitarian crises. For the farmers already burdened by taxes and debt, such disasters felt like proof that the dynasty had lost heaven's favor. In Chinese political philosophy, the mandate of heaven was more than a symbolic idea. It was a fundamental explanation for the rise and fall of dynasties. A ruler who governed wisely and maintained harmony within the empire was believed to possess heaven's approval. But when corruption, disaster, and suffering spread across the land, many people believed that heaven had withdrawn its support. Signs of this loss could appear in many forms: floods, famine, rebellion. Each crisis seemed to confirm that the ruling dynasty was failing in its sacred responsibility to maintain order. By the late Han period, these signs were everywhere. Natural disasters multiplied, economic inequality widened, peasant uprisings erupted across the countryside. Even loyal officials began to question whether the dynasty could survive. Yet, perhaps the most dangerous aspect of the crisis was the growing disconnect between the ruling elite and the ordinary people of the empire. Within the capital, court officials debated political factions and ceremonial rituals. But far from the palace walls, all millions of farmers were struggling simply to survive. Their grievances were rarely heard, their suffering rarely addressed. And in this widening gap between ruler and subject, the final weakness of the Han system was revealed. An empire can possess advanced technology, powerful armies, and sophisticated administration. But if the people who sustain that empire lose faith in its authority, its foundations begin to crumble. By the time rebellion and warlordism spread across the land, the collapse of the Han Dynasty was no longer a sudden catastrophe. It was the inevitable outcome of decades of imbalance. And the final chapter of that collapse would reshape the future of China. By the late years of the Han Dynasty, the empire's crisis had become impossible to conceal. For generations, the Han rulers had governed under the belief that their authority came from the mandate of heaven, a sacred approval granted to emperors who ruled with wisdom and virtue. As long as the dynasty maintained stability and prosperity, heaven's favor was assumed to remain intact. But when suffering spread across the land, people began to wonder whether heaven had withdrawn its blessing. During the final decades of the Han, signs of disorder appeared everywhere. Floods destroyed entire regions of farmland, drought turned fertile soil into cracked earth. Locust swarms devoured crops that farmers had spent months cultivating. These disasters were not unusual in ancient China, but what made the situation different during the late Han period was the government's inability to respond effectively. In earlier centuries, the imperial administration had acted quickly to distribute grain, repair irrigation systems, and reduce taxes during times of crisis. Now, corruption and political conflict paralyzed those systems. The people noticed, and they began to interpret the disasters not simply as natural events, but as evidence that the dynasty itself was failing. Economic instability further deepened this perception. For decades, the Han government had relied on taxation from millions of small farmers to fund its administration and military campaigns. But as land inequality increased and wealthy estates avoided taxation, the imperial treasury began to weaken. To compensate, officials imposed heavier taxes on those still listed in government registers. In some regions, farmers were required to surrender large portions of their harvests simply to satisfy tax collectors. At the same time, the cost of suppressing rebellions and maintaining armies placed enormous strain on the state's finances. Inflation spread throughout the economy. Prices for grain and essential goods rose sharply, making survival even more difficult for ordinary families. But markets that had once symbolized the prosperity of the Han Golden Age now reflected economic instability. For many peasants, the conclusion seemed obvious. The dynasty had lost its ability to govern effectively. When people lose faith in authority, rebellion becomes easier to imagine. The Yellow Turban Rebellion of 184 CE had already demonstrated how quickly rural anger could erupt into organized revolt. Although the imperial armies eventually suppressed the movement, its underlying causes remained unresolved. Famine, debt, and tax burdens continued to plague the countryside. In many regions, smaller rebellions continued to flare up long after the main Yellow Turban forces were defeated. Bandit groups roamed the countryside. Displaced farmers formed militias for self-defense. The distinction between rebellion and survival often blurred. For those who had lost their homes and land, resistance against local officials sometimes seemed like the only path left. These uprisings further weakened the authority of the central government. Each rebellion required military intervention. Each military campaign drained the treasury, and each deployment of troops increased the power of regional commanders who controlled those armies. Meanwhile, political chaos continued inside the imperial court. The struggle between eunuchs and scholar officials had already damaged the credibility of the government. But as the dynasty weakened, new factions emerged among members of the imperial family themselves. Relatives of the emperor attempted to influence court decisions. Ambitious officials formed alliances with military leaders. Political assassinations became disturbingly common. The palace, once the center of imperial authority, increasingly resembled a battlefield of competing interests. Young emperors often ascended the throne without experience or strong political support. Powerful advisors and court factions manipulated these rulers, turning the imperial government into a tool for personal ambition. The result was a government that appeared unstable and unpredictable, and instability breeds opportunity. Regional governors and military commanders began acting more independently. At first, they justified their actions as necessary responses to local crises. If bandits threatened a province, the governor raised additional troops. If famine spread, local leaders organized relief programs without waiting for approval from the capital. These actions were often practical, but they also shifted power away from the central government. As governors built their own armies and alliances with local elites, they became increasingly difficult for the imperial court to control. Some commanders even stopped sending taxes to the capital entirely. Instead, they used those resources to strengthen their own territories. By the late 2nd century, the Han Empire was no longer functioning as a unified state. It had become a loose collection of regional power centers, each governed by leaders with their own ambitions. The emperor still held symbolic authority. Imperial decrees still carried the language of heavenly legitimacy. But symbols alone could not restore the stability that had once defined the dynasty. For many people living in the countryside, the emperor had become a distant and irrelevant figure. Their daily lives were shaped far more by local landlords, military commanders, and village leaders than by officials in the capital. This shift in perception represented a profound transformation. For centuries, Chinese political culture had emphasized loyalty to the emperor as the guardian of social harmony. Now, that loyalty was fading. When people no longer believe in the legitimacy of their rulers, the collapse of a dynasty becomes only a matter of time. Historians often describe the fall of the Han Dynasty as a systemic failure. The empire did not collapse because of a single battle or rebellion. Instead, it gradually weakened as multiple pressures converged. Economic inequality eroded the tax system. Political corruption paralyzed the government. Environmental disasters intensified social unrest. Military commanders accumulated power that rivaled the authority of the emperor. Each of these problems alone might have been manageable. Together, they created a crisis that no reform could easily solve. By the early 3rd century, the empire had already begun transforming into something else. A landscape dominated not by a single dynasty, but by competing regional states. Yet even as the Han political system disintegrated, its cultural and intellectual achievements continued to influence the people who lived within its former borders. Confucian scholars still studied classical texts. Farmers still used iron tools developed during the dynasty's golden age. Merchants still traveled along trade routes that the Han had opened centuries earlier. The structures of Han civilization were too deeply rooted to vanish overnight. Instead, they would survive the dynasty's collapse and shape the new political order that emerged from the chaos. But before that new order could fully form, China would endure decades of warfare between rival warlords and kingdoms. The fall of the Han Dynasty was not the end of Chinese civilization. It was the beginning of a new and turbulent chapter, one that would become known as the Era of the Three Kingdoms. When the Han Dynasty finally disappeared in 220 CE, China did not simply fall into darkness. The political system that had ruled the empire for centuries collapsed, but the civilization it had built remained remarkably resilient. Cities still stood, trade routes still functioned, and scholars continued studying the texts that had shaped Chinese philosophy and governance. What followed was not the destruction of Han civilization. It was its transformation. The period that emerged after the dynasty's fall would become known as the Three Kingdoms era, a time of competing states, legendary military campaigns, and dramatic political alliances. But beneath the warfare and intrigue, the legacy of the Han Dynasty continued to shape the world that replaced it. The first evidence of this continuity appeared in the governments of the new kingdoms themselves. Although Cao Pi had ended the Han Dynasty and declared the creation of the Wei Dynasty, and he did not abandon the administrative systems that the Han had perfected. In fact, he relied heavily on them. The bureaucratic structure of provincial governors, tax registers, and administrative districts remained largely intact. Scholar officials trained in Confucian classics continued to manage government institutions. Even the rituals of imperial authority, court ceremonies, official titles, and bureaucratic ranks were preserved. The new rulers understood something important. The Han system worked. Despite its eventual collapse, it had governed a vast population for centuries. It had created economic prosperity, technological innovation, and cultural unity across an enormous territory. Replacing that system entirely would have been risky and unnecessary. Instead, the new kingdoms adopted Han institutions while competing for control of the empire. In the north, the state of Wei inherited much of the Han administrative framework. Cao Pi and his successors governed from the northern heartland, where the agricultural infrastructure and bureaucratic networks built during the Han era still supported large populations. The Wei state maintained detailed tax records, organized agricultural production, and continued recruiting educated officials into government service. Even military organization reflected Han traditions. Large, standing armies remained essential to maintaining control over northern China, and the government relied on established logistical systems to supply those forces. Although the dynasty had changed, the structure of governance remained deeply rooted in Han practices. In the west, Liu Bei's kingdom of Shu also claimed direct connection to the Han legacy. Liu Bei had always presented himself as a protector of the Han royal lineage, and when he declared himself emperor in 221 CE, he named his state Shu Han, explicitly linking his rule to the fallen dynasty. This symbolic choice was not accidental. Many scholars and officials who served Liu Bei believed that the Han dynasty had been unjustly overthrown. By invoking the Han name, Liu Bei attempted to restore legitimacy and unite supporters who remained loyal to the old imperial tradition. Within Shu, Han-style administration continued. Government offices recorded taxes and population data. Officials trained in Confucian philosophy guided policy decisions. The bureaucracy remained small compared to the massive system that had existed during the height of the Han Empire, but its principles remained familiar. Even in a time of war, the intellectual foundations of Han governance endured. In the southeast, Sun Quan's kingdom of Wu developed its own version of the Han administrative model. Sun Quan ruled a region that had been less developed during the earlier Han centuries, for large areas of southern China were still sparsely populated compared to the fertile northern plains. Yet under Wu's leadership, these regions began to grow rapidly. New irrigation projects expanded farmland along the Yangtze River Valley. Trade through southern ports connected China to maritime networks across Southeast Asia. To manage this expansion, the Wu government adopted bureaucratic practices inherited from the Han system. Officials kept detailed records of agricultural production and population growth. Local administrators governed districts while reporting to the central court. Once again, the Han administrative blueprint proved adaptable even in regions that had once been peripheral to the empire. While political authority was divided among three rival states, cultural unity remained remarkably strong. The Chinese language continued to bind the population together. Scholars across the kingdoms studied the same Confucian classics and historical texts that had shaped intellectual life during the Han era. Literary culture flourished despite constant warfare. Poetry became a powerful medium for expressing the uncertainties of the age. Many writers reflected on the rise and fall of the Han Dynasty as a cautionary tale about the fragility of political power. Historians carefully documented the events of the Three Kingdoms period, preserving records of battles, alliances, and political decisions. One of the most important historical works describing this era was later written by Chen Shao, whose text, Records of the Three Kingdoms, would become the foundation for later historical and literary interpretations of the period. Through such works, the memory of the Han Dynasty remained alive. Its achievements and its failures continued to shape how people understood their own time. The technological legacy of the Han also endured. Paper remained the dominant medium for writing and record-keeping. Iron tools continued to support agriculture across the countryside. Irrigation systems built during the Han era remained vital to food production. Even the trade routes that connected China to Central Asia and beyond continued functioning despite political fragmentation. Merchants adapted quickly to the new political realities. Instead of trading within a single empire, they negotiated with multiple kingdoms. Silk, ceramics, and other Chinese goods still traveled westward along caravan routes that had first been secured during the Han Dynasty. Foreign goods continued arriving in Chinese markets. The networks of commerce built during the Han Golden Age proved resilient enough to survive the empire's collapse. Yet, despite this cultural and technological continuity, the political landscape had changed permanently. The Three Kingdoms period was marked by nearly constant warfare. Rival states competed for territory and resources. Generals launched campaigns across mountains and rivers in attempts to weaken their opponents. Strategists developed complex military plans that would later become legendary in Chinese history. But beneath these dramatic battles lay a deeper reality. Each kingdom understood that true victory would not come from military power alone. To rule China effectively, a leader needed something more enduring: a functioning bureaucracy, a stable agricultural system, a population that believed in the legitimacy of the government. In other words, the very foundations that the Han Dynasty had once built. For centuries afterward, Chinese historians would look back on the Han Dynasty as a defining moment in their civilization's development. The Han had established a model of governance that later dynasties sought to replicate. They had demonstrated the power of technological innovation combined with administrative discipline, and they had revealed how fragile even the most sophisticated empire could be when corruption, inequality, and neglect eroded its foundations. The fall of the Han was not merely the end of a dynasty, it was a lesson, a reminder that the success of a civilization depends not only on its inventions or military strength, but on the balance between rulers and the people they govern. In the centuries that followed, Chinese leaders would continue studying that lesson carefully, because the shadow of the Han Dynasty stretched far into the future, and its legacy would shape every dynasty that came after it. By the time the Han Dynasty finally disappeared from the political map of China, its story had already become something larger than the fate of a single ruling family. It had become a case study in the rise and fall of power. For more than 400 years, the Han had governed one of the largest and most advanced societies in the ancient world. Their empire connected distant regions through roads and trade networks, supported tens of millions of people through sophisticated agricultural systems, and produced innovations that would reshape global civilization: paper, iron technology, bureaucratic administration, long-distance trade routes that linked East Asia to Central Asia and beyond. These achievements were not accidental. They were the result of deliberate policies, disciplined governance, and a culture that valued knowledge and organization. And yet, despite all of this brilliance, the Han Dynasty ultimately collapsed. Understanding why that collapse occurred reveals lessons that extend far beyond ancient China. At the heart of the Han system was a remarkable balance. The empire depended on cooperation between three major forces: the central government, the educated bureaucracy, and the agricultural population that produced the empire's food and tax revenue. When this balance worked properly, the results were extraordinary. The government collected taxes that funded infrastructure projects and military defense. Officials recorded information and managed local affairs with administrative precision. Farmers cultivated land with improved tools and irrigation systems, generating surpluses that supported cities and trade networks. And each part of the system reinforced the others. But this balance was fragile, and over time it began to shift. One of the most damaging changes involved land ownership. As powerful aristocratic families accumulated vast estates, the economic foundation of the empire began to erode. These estates were efficient agricultural enterprises, but they operated largely outside the imperial tax system. Through political influence and manipulation of land records, wealthy families often avoided paying the taxes that small farmers were required to contribute. This created a structural imbalance. The state depended on tax revenue from independent farmers, yet those farmers were gradually disappearing. Many lost their land due to debt, natural disasters, or economic pressure from large estates. Once they became tenant laborers, their contributions to the tax system declined dramatically. The government responded by increasing taxes on those who remained registered as landowners, which only accelerated the cycle of poverty and land loss. By the late Han period, the empire's financial system was under enormous strain. Political corruption deepened the crisis. The struggle between eunuchs and Confucian officials inside the imperial court weakened the credibility of the government. Instead of focusing on administrative reform or economic recovery, many officials spent their energy fighting factional battles. Capable administrators were purged or driven away from public service. Those who remained often advanced their careers through political alliances rather than competence. The bureaucracy that had once been the pride of the Han system began to lose its effectiveness. Local problems went unresolved. Reports from provincial governors were ignored or manipulated, and the imperial court gradually lost touch with conditions in the countryside. Environmental disasters amplified these weaknesses. Floods along the Yellow River destroyed farmland and displaced entire communities. Droughts caused harvest failures that spread famine across rural regions. In earlier periods, the Han government had responded to such crises by distributing grain from state granaries and reducing taxes. But during the later years of the dynasty, corruption and financial strain limited the government's ability to act. Relief efforts were often slow or insufficient. For farmers already burdened by debt and taxation, these disasters reinforced the belief that the dynasty had lost heaven's favor. In Chinese political thought, natural disasters were often interpreted as warnings from the heavens. When they occurred repeatedly, many people concluded that the ruling dynasty no longer possessed the mandate of heaven. The rise of regional military leaders completed the breakdown of imperial authority. During the Yellow Turban Rebellion, the Han government had relied on provincial commanders to raise armies and restore order. This decision solved an immediate crisis but created a long-term problem. Those commanders retained their armies after the rebellion ended. With thousands of loyal soldiers under their command, they began governing their territories independently of the imperial court. These warlords collected taxes, built alliances with local elites, and expanded their military strength. By the time the central government attempted to reassert control, it was too late. The empire had already fragmented. The Han emperor remained a symbolic figure, but real power belonged to the commanders who controlled armies and resources. The final abdication of the Han throne in 220 CE simply acknowledged a political reality that had existed for decades. Despite this collapse, the Han Dynasty remains one of the most influential empires in world history. Its innovations reshaped not only China, but global civilization. Paper, which emerged during the Han period, eventually spread westward through Central Asia and the Islamic world before reaching Europe. Its adoption transformed communication, education, and administration across continents. Iron agricultural tools increased food production and supported population growth throughout East Asia. On the Silk Road connected distant civilizations through networks of trade and cultural exchange, and the bureaucratic model of government established during the Han period became the foundation for nearly every Chinese dynasty that followed. Few ancient states left such a lasting legacy. The Han story also reveals something important about the nature of empires. Technological advancement alone cannot guarantee stability. The Han Dynasty possessed some of the most sophisticated technology and administrative systems of the ancient world. But those achievements could not protect the empire from internal decay. When corruption spread within the court, when economic inequality weakened the countryside, and when political leaders lost the trust of the people they governed, the entire system became vulnerable. Eventually, even the strongest institutions could not prevent collapse. This pattern appears repeatedly throughout history. Great empires rise through innovation, organization, and expansion. They reach a golden age where prosperity and cultural achievement flourish. But maintaining that success requires constant balance between power and responsibility. When ruling elites become disconnected from the populations they govern, instability grows. When economic inequality concentrates wealth in the hands of a few, the foundations of the state weaken. And when political institutions become consumed by internal conflict, the ability to respond to crises disappears. The Han Dynasty experienced all of these pressures. Its fall was not sudden. It was the final stage of a slow transformation. Yet even in collapse, the Han legacy endured. The administrative system, cultural traditions, and technological innovations developed during the dynasty continued shaping Chinese civilization for centuries. Future dynasties would rise and fall, but the Han model remained the blueprint for governance, and the memory of the Han Golden Age would continue inspiring generations of scholars, rulers, and historians. Because within its story lies a powerful reminder. The strength of a civilization is not measured only by its wealth or inventions. It is measured by the balance between those who rule and those who sustain the empire. When that balance holds, greatness can endure. When it breaks, even the most brilliant golden age can fade into history. When the Han Dynasty ended in 220 CE, the event did not simply close a chapter of Chinese history. It marked the end of an era that had fundamentally reshaped civilization across East Asia and beyond. For more than 4 centuries, the Han Empire had stood as one of the most advanced and influential societies on Earth. Its rulers governed a population that rivaled that of the Roman Empire on the opposite side of the Eurasian continent. Its administrators maintained an intricate bureaucracy capable of managing agriculture, trade, taxation, infrastructure, and military defense across enormous distances. At its height, the Han Dynasty represented something extraordinary: a civilization powered by innovation. An empire built not only on armies, but on systems of knowledge, technology, and administration that allowed millions of people to live and work within a structured political order. Yet the fall of the Han Dynasty reminds us of a fundamental truth about power. Even the most sophisticated systems can collapse when the balance that sustains them is lost. The Han Empire's golden age was fueled by breakthroughs that transformed nearly every aspect of life. Iron metallurgy revolutionized agriculture. With stronger plows, axes, and farming tools, farmers could cultivate larger areas of land and produce more food than ever before. This agricultural expansion supported a rapidly growing population and created the surplus necessary to sustain cities, armies, and government institutions. Paper transformed communication. For the first time, information could be recorded, copied, and distributed efficiently across a vast empire. Government officials could track taxes and population data with greater precision. Scholars could preserve historical records and philosophical texts. The invention that might appear simple at first glance became one of the most powerful tools of administration and education in human history. And then there was the Silk Road. Through diplomatic missions and military expansion, the Han Dynasty opened trade routes that connected China with Central Asia, the Middle East, and eventually the Mediterranean world. Goods moved across these routes: silk, spices, metals, horses, and precious stones, but so did ideas. Cultures met, technologies spread, and civilizations that had once developed in relative isolation became part of a larger network of exchange. The Han Empire had become a global power, yet innovation alone could not protect the dynasty from the forces that would eventually destroy it. The greatest threats to the Han system did not come from foreign invasion. They came from within. The gradual concentration of land in the hands of powerful aristocratic families weakened the economic foundation of the empire. The tax system that supported the government began to fail as wealthy estates avoided their obligations. At the same time, the political center of the empire became increasingly unstable. The struggle between eunuchs and Confucian officials created an atmosphere of distrust and factional conflict within the imperial court. Instead of addressing the growing problems in the countryside, many leaders focused on personal power struggles. As corruption spread and capable officials were removed from office, the bureaucracy that had once governed the empire efficiently began to deteriorate. The consequences reached far beyond the palace walls. Farmers, who formed the backbone of the Han economy, faced increasing hardship. Heavy taxes, natural disasters, and growing inequality pushed many rural communities toward poverty and rebellion. When the Yellow Turban Uprising erupted in 184 CE, it revealed how fragile the empire had become. What began as a spiritual movement among desperate peasants quickly evolved into one of the largest rebellions in Chinese history. The government eventually suppressed the revolt, but the damage had already been done. To defeat the rebels, the Han court relied on regional commanders who raised their own armies. These commanders soon realized that the power they wielded did not depend on imperial approval. With soldiers loyal to them personally, and they began governing territories as independent rulers. The central authority of the Han Dynasty slowly dissolved. The emperor remained on the throne, but real power had shifted into the hands of warlords. By the early 3rd century, China was no longer a unified empire. It had become a landscape of competing states. And when Xiao Pi forced the abdication of the last Han emperor in 220 CE, the dynasty that had once ruled a continental superpower officially came to an end. Yet history rarely allows a civilization's achievements to vanish entirely. Even as the political structure of the Han Empire collapsed, its ideas and institutions survived. The bureaucratic model of governance developed during the Han period became the foundation for nearly every Chinese dynasty that followed. Later, rulers refined the civil service examination system, selecting officials based on education and merit rather than aristocratic birth. Confucian philosophy continued to guide political thought and social values. Technological innovations introduced during the Han era, paper, iron tools, irrigation systems, remained central to Chinese society for centuries, and the trade routes opened during the dynasty's expansion continued connecting China with distant civilizations long after the empire itself had fallen. Perhaps the most remarkable legacy of the Han Dynasty is found in identity itself. To this day, the majority ethnic group in China refers to itself as the Han people. The name of the dynasty has become synonymous with the cultural foundation of Chinese civilization. Few empires in world history have left such a lasting imprint on the identity of an entire people. The story of the Han Dynasty is not simply a tale of ancient kings and battles. It is a story about systems. It shows how technological innovation, administrative organization, and cultural philosophy can combine to create a powerful and enduring civilization. But it also demonstrates how fragile that system can become when its internal balance is disturbed. When wealth concentrates in the hands of a few, when political institutions become consumed by corruption, when the suffering of ordinary people is ignored, even the most brilliant golden age can begin to unravel. In the centuries that followed the fall of the Han Dynasty, Chinese historians studied this period carefully. They examined the records of emperors, officials, farmers, and rebels. They debated the causes of the dynasty's collapse and the lessons that future rulers should learn. Because the rise and fall of the Han was more than a historical event. It was a warning, a reminder that the strength of a civilization depends not only on its inventions or armies, but on the relationship between rulers and the people they govern. The Han Dynasty mastered iron. It invented paper. It connected continents through trade. Yet in the end, the fate of the empire rested on something far simpler: trust. When that trust was lost, even the most advanced empire of its age could not survive. And so the Han Dynasty passed into history, not only as one of China's greatest golden ages of innovation, but as one of its most powerful lessons about power, balance, and the fragile machinery of civilization.